What's something that you're longing for? Not just looking forward to or thinking about, but yearning for. What's something you're hoping for, waiting for yourself, or your family, or our world? What is it that you want with every part of your being? Maybe it's peace, financial stability, reconciliation with an estranged family member. I wonder how many people know that you're longing for that thing. Does anyone? We all know what this kind of deep longing feels like. Yet for so many of us, it's hard or impossible to talk about it. I'm speaking from personal experience, and today I'm walking the walk, as I'd like to share with you my experience of longing for something and the pain of not knowing how to make it happen. On a Shabbat morning in June, I participated for the first time in what is maybe the cutest Beth El tradition, maybe the cutest ritual I've ever seen, which is tiny treasures. For anyone who doesn't know, come check it out. There's a Saturday morning in June each year where we invite families who've had a baby in the last 12 months to join us for services, and at a certain point they all come up to the bima for a blessing. Imagine just a bunch of the freshest, newest, most adorable babies all together on the bima. I love my job. I gave a blessing to the babies and their parents. And before I did, I made a comment about how we know that there are many people who thought they'd be new parents this year, but they aren't. I said that it's important to name and acknowledge that fertility journeys can be fickle. And I reminded everyone that we, as the Beth El clergy and leadership, are here to be supportive on those journeys however we can be. At Kiddush that day, a number of you came up and thanked me. You said you hadn't heard something like that from the bima, and some of you confided in me sharing details of your own fertility journeys. It might have been surprising just how many people have experienced difficulty in that regard, because so often people feel like they have to suffer in silence. I sat and listened to you, and I responded by telling you that it's important for us as community leaders to talk about things like infertility more often, so that we can slowly but steadily end the stigma surrounding it. It turns out it's easier said than done, because what I didn't tell you that day is that when I stood on the bima and talked about the difficulty many people face when trying to grow their families, I was speaking from personal experience. And really, I was speaking to myself. If you really think back hard, you'll remember that Ilana wasn't here that morning at all, and that shortly after giving that blessing, I left the bima. At that point in June, we'd had our infertility diagnosis for about 6 months, and we'd spent what felt like countless hours and what was countless dollars at Diamond Women's Center, the clinic in Edina, which for most of 2024 has been our home away from home. If you know us, you know we love babies, and we love a good simcha, or celebration. But that was a hard day. With so much love and excitement for those families, they had something we desperately wanted. Something that no matter how hard we tried and cried, we didn't know how to make happen or how long it would take for ourselves. And so here I am finally practicing what I've preached for so long. We need to be able to talk about the pain and the grief and the longing so often associated with fertility and infertility, the journey towards conception and pregnancy. In fact, we all must practice naming out loud what it is we're longing for, what we're trying for, what it is we so deeply yearn for. It's hard to experience that unrealized desire, and so much harder to do it alone. And equally, we have to practice listening, sitting with people in their grief. It's difficult to fight the urge to try to fix it. But being a supportive friend, family member, or neighbor means being willing to listen and to say, I hear you, I see you, and often not much more than that. For us, we weren't able to figure out exactly how to start talking about it when we were deep in it. We didn't have the energy, the capacity, or the words. But now that together we've decided that it's the right time, in some way standing here, my teshuvah begins. Rosh Hashanah is described as Hayom, Harat, Olam, which is traditionally understood as the day the world was born. We'll say this phrase 3 times, today and yesterday, after each blast of the shofar. This translation, the day the world was born, jives with our understanding of what Rosh Hashanah is, the celebration of the creation of the world. But we learn in the Torah readings for Rosh Hashanah from yesterday that the word hara does not mean birth, but rather conception. As the reading opens, Vatahar vateled Sarah. Sarah conceived and bore a son to Avraham in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken. Vatahar, she conceived, comes from the root hey resh hey, as in Hayom, Harat, Olam. Our ancestor Sarah was one of the first to experience infertility. She's referred to as akara, or barren, earlier in Breshit, where it's written ein la valad, she had no children. Disappointingly, but not surprisingly, the ancient rabbis focus on grammar and pulling halachic threads out of these verses, and we've inherited a tradition that asks, what are the halachic implications of not having children, and what are the implications for Avraham, but not how was she feeling? So we're left to imagine it ourselves. How was Sarah feeling? Although the text itself does not clarify, we know how Sarah yearned for a child, and we watch her as she desperately tries anything she can to make it happen, including pushing Avraham to her maidservant Hagar. If not with me, perhaps you can make a baby with her, she seems to say. But as we know, this does not work. Sarah comes to hate Hagar and blame Avraham, saying, Chamasi alecha, this wrong that has been done to me is your fault. Sephorno, the 15th century commentary, writes that in blaming Avraham, Sarah reveals her deep hurt and isolation. Whereas earlier, Sarah and Hagar are introduced as a pair. Commentators point out how it's unique that Hagar is specifically Sarah's maidservant, not Avraham's or of the household. Sarah has come to see herself as at odds with everyone else, Sarah against the world. And Sarah's story is not the only fertility journey we read about on Rosh Hashanah, as yesterday's Haftarah told the story of Hannah. Ulchana ein yeladim, Hannah who's described as having no children. Ve'Hashem sagar rachma, Hannah whose womb was closed by God. In Hannah's case, the text is a little more explicit in its imagery and description of Hannah's mental state. Hannah was provoked severely to anger and misery. Eventually, like with Sarah, it is written about Hannah, Vatahar vateled. She conceived and she gave birth. Our rabbis ask about the specific language used in both of these verses. Vatahar vateled. They conceived, then they gave birth. Surely if they teled, gave birth, then they must have tahar, conceived first. And so commentators ask, why are both written? If the Torah could have just said, then she had a baby, why do the verses make such a point to say vatahar vateled? Why do we focus on conception, on this word and this concept that are so prevalent throughout today's liturgy, throughout Rosh Hashanah? Maybe this emphasis on conception comes to tell us, don't forget her longing. Don't forget how much she waited for and wanted this child. My teacher, Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld, suggests that perhaps here too on Rosh Hashanah, the liturgy is reminding us, don't forget the longing. Don't forget the waiting. Don't forget the wanting. That's the real story of birth. That's the real story of creation. And it's the real story of teshuvah. Just as Sarah and Hannah longed to give birth to their children, just as God longed to give birth to the world, so this day begins with our own willingness to take the risk of longing. If something new is going to happen, if anything new is going to happen, whether in our hearts or our homes, in our communities or in our world, we're going to have to take the risk of wanting it. What does that mean? It means we have to acknowledge the longing, lean into the longing, name it, say it out loud, even as we know sometimes it will hurt. And that sometimes our longing will make us feel alone. Sometimes we'll feel like we're the only ones who have ever yearned for this thing. Like maybe we're being unreasonable. Maybe I should just make do with what I have. Maybe I should get used to not talking to that family member. Am I overreacting? Others have it worse. I'll get through it. We're really good at talking ourselves out of sharing vulnerably about our life experiences. But our liturgy today, these verses and phrases which we'll repeat over and over again, come to remind us that if we want to effect change in our lives, we must take the bold step of saying so. As many of you know, we are, God willing, going to be parents in about 5 months. We get more excited each day, and still I think I don't fully believe it. We're keenly aware of the precarious nature of creating new life. And every day we wake up and Ilana's still pregnant, we thank God and Dr. Persh at the clinic. We feel so lucky. And we also carry longing for our friends and community members who are very much in the throes of this particular type of journey. We've been talking a lot in our house this year about the idea that everything happens at the time that it's supposed to. And that may be true, and it may not be. For us, it has been. We've said to each other that, it was hard, but this is happening at the right time. Like in the Torah, the reading that began, Vatahar vateled Sarah, Sarah conceived and gave birth, as we discussed, at the set time which God had appointed. Lamoed asher diber oto Elohim. Maybe things happen when they're supposed to, at the right time. It could be that Sarah had to go through some sort of journey before becoming a parent. It could be that this was the right time for her to finally become pregnant and give birth to Isaac. But here's the key. That's something we can say to ourselves. But that's really about it. It can be a beautiful and empowering thing to be able to say, wow, the timing of my life has worked out really well. Or, we weren't really ready back then, and it's good that this is how it happened instead. But it's a really hard thing to hear externally. It's less helpful or supportive to hear someone say, see, everything happens when it's supposed to, or it'll happen when it's meant to. Because when we're in the thick of it, whether it's a fertility journey or some other deep, unrealized longing, it's hard. It's really hard to hear, it'll happen when the time is right. Hayom, Harat, Olam. Today the world is conceived. Today we celebrate creation, and we make sure to acknowledge everything that had to happen leading up to it. Just as Sarah and Hannah longed to give birth to their children, just as God longed to give birth to the world, so this day begins with our own willingness to take the risk of longing. Unlike God, we cannot speak the world into existence. But by speaking to each other, by naming intentionally that for which we long, we can hopefully find some measure of comfort and strength on our journeys. If anything new is going to happen, we have to take the risk of wanting it. And so as 5785 begins, let this be the year that we courageously name what it is we are yearning for. May we know always that we are not alone. May we find the compassion to listen lovingly to others as they come to us. And may we find the strength to talk about our longing. Shana Tova.